What happens when the world's biggest smartphone maker spends years building a custom processor, only to kill it off after 5 generations? This is the story of Samsung's Mongoose CPU cores, an ambitious quest to beat Apple and Qualcomm at their own game, and how it all went wrong. In the mid-2010s, Samsung set its sights on a silicon prize. Apple was crushing it with custom A-series chips, and Qualcomm's processors powered most top Android phones. Samsung didn't want to just assemble parts. It wanted in-house bragging rights. The plan? Develop a custom CPU core, codenamed Mongoose, to give its Exynos mobile chips a unique edge. Designing a CPU core from scratch is no small feat. Most companies simply license ready-made core designs from ARM, the company behind the fundamental architecture used in nearly all smartphones. Think of ARM cores as prefab building blocks. Samsung, however, obtained an ARM architecture license, meaning it could create its own core design that still runs the standard ARM instruction set. It's like getting a blank blueprint and drawing your own house, instead of buying a pre-designed model. The potential reward? Better performance and control. The risk? Immense engineering challenge, cost, and the possibility it might not pan out. Samsung wasn't the first to try this. Qualcomm had its custom crate cores earlier, and of course Apple's success with bespoke CPU designs was a big motivator. In fact, Samsung's codename Mongoose was a cheeky dig at Qualcomm's crate, a type of snake. After all, a mongoose is famous for killing snakes. Samsung was sending a message: "We're coming for you." So Samsung built a dream team at its Austin, Texas R&D Center, SARC, around 2012. Top chip architects were hired to craft a high-performance mobile CPU core. By late 2015, they had something ready to show the world. The stage was set to introduce Mongoose M1, Samsung's first-ever custom smartphone CPU core, inside the new Exynos 8890 chip. In early 2016, Samsung launched the Galaxy S7, and inside international models was the Exynos 8890, featuring the brand new Mongoose M1 cores. For the first time, Samsung wasn't just using ARM's off-the-shelf Cortex cores, it had its own silicon brain. The M1 core ran up to about 2.6 GHz and was paired in a classic big-little setup: 4 big M1 cores for heavy lifting, plus 4 small ARM. Cortex A53 cores for efficiency. On paper, the M1 looked potent. It was designed with a superscalar, out-of-order pipeline, meaning it could execute multiple instructions simultaneously and reorder tasks for speed. The goal? Higher IPC, instructions per cycle, than standard ARM cores. IPC is a key measure of how much work a CPU can do in one clock tick. Think of it like this: 2 engines running at the same RPM, clock speed, can produce different power if one is more efficient internally. That's IPC. Samsung's idea was to make a core that could do more per tick than the competition. Early results were promising. In benchmarks, the Exynos 8890 with Mongoose M1 held its own against Qualcomm's Snapdragon 820, which used Qualcomm's own cryo cores. The M1 delivered strong multi-core performance. Having 4 heavyweight cores helped it outpace the quad-core Snapdragon in tasks that used many threads. Even in single-core tests, M1 was competitive. The Galaxy S7's Exynos often slightly edged out the Snapdragon variant. Real-world impact? The Galaxy S7 with Exynos was snappy and even earned a reputation for slightly better battery life than its Snapdragon sibling. Samsung's gamble seemed to be working. At least initially, Mongoose M1 gave Samsung parity with Qualcomm and a foot in the door toward Apple's territory. It wasn't an Apple-beating monster yet, but as a first-gen custom core, it was respectable. Samsung had proved it could design a mobile CPU from scratch, a proud moment. Behind the scenes, success meant validation for the Austin team and Samsung's strategy. With M1 out, they immediately turned to the next iteration, aiming higher. The race was on, and each year the stakes would grow. Samsung's second-gen core, Mongoose M2, arrived in 2017 inside the Exynos 8895, Galaxy S8 and Note 8. This was a refinement of the first design. The basic architecture was similar, but on a newer 10-nanometer manufacturing process, down from 14 nanometer. A smaller transistor size meant better efficiency and higher potential clock speeds. Samsung modestly tweaked the design, slightly larger internal buffers here, some tuning there, nothing radical. The clocks remained around 2.3 GHz, focusing on efficiency gains from the new process. The result? Exynos 8895 with M2 was again solid. The Galaxy S8's Exynos variant and the Snapdragon 835 variant were, as many noted, a close fight. Any performance gap was minor, any battery life difference was marginal. If anything, Samsung's chip had a slight edge in a few areas. It was essentially a tie, which in itself was a win for Samsung's strategy. They stayed competitive using their own core. Importantly, there were no glaring flaws or regressions. If you bought an international Galaxy S8 with Exynos, you weren't missing out on performance or battery life compared to the US model with Qualcomm. All seemed well. Then came Mongoose M3 in 2018, and Samsung decided to go big. Really big. The Exynos 9810, Galaxy S9, packed the M3 cores, and this design was a major overhaul. Samsung widened the core dramatically to a 6-wide decode, up from 4-wide in M1/M2, and added deeper execution resources. In simple terms, M3 could chew through more instructions in parallel than before, like adding more lanes to a highway, so more cars, instructions, can drive at once. The M3's clocks skyrocketed to nearly 2.9 GHz, a significant jump. Samsung boasted roughly 2 times higher single-core performance over the previous generation, an eye-opening claim. On synthetic benchmarks, the M3 delivered. Geekbench scores showed the Exynos 9810 nearly doubling the single-core performance of the Exynos 8895 from a year earlier. In fact, Exynos 9810's single-core results even exceeded Qualcomm's Snapdragon 845 by a large margin in Geekbench. It looked like Samsung had finally taken a clear lead, at least on paper. Tech enthusiasts saw that big 6-wide core flex its muscles in benchmarks, posting numbers closer to Apple's mighty A11 chip. For a moment, Samsung's Mongoose core seemed poised to reach the heights of Apple's custom silicon. But reality was more complicated. While M3 was a beast in short bursts, it came with baggage. That wider, faster core was power-hungry and ran hot. CPU thermal throttling became a talking point. This is when a processor, under sustained load, heats up and has to slow itself down to prevent overheating. In a smartphone, you can't have desktop-sized cooling, so managing heat is critical. The Exynos 9810's M3 core could sprint, but it couldn't run a marathon without breaking a sweat. Early user experiences with the Galaxy S9 revealed an odd dichotomy. Some tasks flew, for instance, heavy single-threaded workloads, like certain app operations, felt extremely fast. But under continuous stress or in poorly optimized scenarios, the Exynos chip would throttle and sometimes perform worse than the steadier Snapdragon 845. One anecdote from a developer. A custom app doing intense computations ran silky smooth on the Exynos S9 initially, whereas the Snapdragon S9 stuttered at first, proof of the Exynos M3's raw power. Yet after sustained use, the Snapdragon tended to catch up as the Exynos slowed to rein in temperatures. It became clear that peak performance wasn't the same as sustained performance. Another challenge was software optimization. The M3 core's 6-wide design was ahead of its time for Android apps. Many apps weren't optimized to fully utilize that much parallel execution, leading to diminishing returns. As one observer put it, the Exynos M3 was so wide and different that a lot of software just didn't know how to take advantage of it. It was like giving a race car engine to a regular sedan. The potential is there, but everyday roads and drivers can't unlock it. Meanwhile, the extra silicon and power draw were very real, even when the benefits weren't. Power efficiency suffered. The Galaxy S9 with Exynos trailed its Snapdragon counterpart in battery endurance tests. And not by trivial amounts. In some reviews, the Exynos model lasted almost an hour less in screen-on time compared to the Snapdragon model. For Samsung, this was alarming. Users in regions with Exynos models were starting to complain that they got the inferior device when it came to battery life, and sometimes even performance consistency. The once minor differences were widening into visible gaps, By the end of 2018, Samsung found itself at a crossroads. The M3 core achieved the promised speed gains on paper, but it also exposed the downsides of an aggressive design. The message from the market was clear. In a smartphone, balance matters more than bragging rights. A super-wide, hot-running core that dies early on battery was not the victory Samsung needed. For the 2019 Galaxy S10, Samsung rolled out the Mongoose M4 core inside the Exynos 9820 and later 9825. This time, the approach was a bit different. Samsung dialed things back to address the M3's issues. The manufacturing node moved to 8 nanometers, slightly improved from 10 nanometers. And interestingly, Samsung altered the CPU cluster arrangement. Instead of 4 big Mongoose cores, the Exynos 9820 used a tri-cluster setup. 2 M4 cores, 2 medium ARM Cortex A75 cores, and 4 small Cortex A55 cores. By using only 2 custom cores at the high end, plus 2 medium cores, Samsung was tacitly admitting that 4 power-hungry Mongoose cores were overkill for most scenarios. This 2+2+4 design aimed to improve efficiency, letting the mid-tier cores handle moderate loads, reserving the beefy M4s for only the heaviest tasks. The M4 itself was more of a tune-up than a ground-up redesign. It still had a 6-wide decode and similar deep pipeline as the M3, but with tweaks for efficiency and some new instruction support, ARM 8.2 features, like FP16 and dot product acceleration. Samsung actually lowered the peak clock to around 2.3 to 2.4 GHz on the M4 for the Galaxy S10, significantly below the 2.7 plus GHz of the M3. On the surface that looked like a downgrade, but it was a calculated trade-off to curb heat and battery drain. So how did it work out? Mixed results. In terms of raw performance, Samsung lost its brief edge. Qualcomm's Snapdragon 855, built on a 7-nanometer process and using ARM's Cortex A76-based cores, matched or exceeded the Exynos 9820 in many CPU tests. For instance, in Geekbench 4, the Snapdragon S10 actually beat the Exynos in multi-core, a surprise, given Exynos's historical advantage there. The M4's single-core was still strong and slightly ahead in Geekbench, but not by much. Essentially, the Snapdragon 855 caught up and even pulled ahead in CPU horsepower, except for a few niche areas. Samsung's custom core no longer looked superior on specs. It was now arguably a step behind the latest ARM designs that Qualcomm employed. On the GPU side, the gap remained. Samsung was still using off-the-shelf ARM Mali GPUs, which in 2019 lagged behind Qualcomm's Adreno GPUs. The Galaxy S10's Mali G76MP12 GPU was good, but the Adreno 640 in Snapdragon 855 was better in many games and benchmarks. There was one odd twist. In one graphics benchmark, GFX Bench Manhattan, the Exynos S10 actually scored higher FPS than the Snapdragon S10, possibly due to differences in power management. But overall, Adreno held the advantage in real gameplay. The average user wouldn't notice huge GPU differences in casual use, but heavy gamers saw smoother performance and cooler devices on the Snapdragon variant. The battery life story remained troublesome. Despite the efficiency tweaks, the Exynos 9820 Galaxy S10 still tended to die faster than the Snapdragon model. One test found the Snapdragon S10 Plus lasted about 45 minutes longer than the Exynos S10 Plus in a controlled battery rundown. Neither was class-leading, but the gap meant Exynos users had less wiggle room. In day-to-day use, that might be the difference between making it to bedtime or having to reach for a charger in the evening. By now, tech enthusiasts and media were taking note of the pattern. Year after year, Samsung's Exynos phones were falling a bit behind their Snapdragon twins in the critical metric of power efficiency. And if efficiency is worse, that often means the phone runs hotter under load as well. The Exynos 9820 wasn't a bad chip at all. It performed well, and the phone was still among the fastest on Android that year. But Samsung's lofty goal of beating Apple's chips or clearly outclassing Qualcomm's cores was not materializing. In fact, the opposite risk loomed. What if Samsung's costly custom core was actually yielding a worse product for Galaxy buyers? Inside Samsung, that question had to be unsettling. The Austin CPU team had poured heart and soul into these designs, but the returns were diminishing. Meanwhile, Apple had launched its A12 Bionic in late 2018, extending its lead in both performance and efficiency. Apple's focus on high IPC and tight integration was paying off. iPhones were sprinting ahead in speed tests, yet lasting long on battery. Qualcomm, on the other hand, had smartly pivoted after some custom core missteps. By leveraging ARM's Cortex cores and focusing on GPU and modem strengths, they churned out very well-rounded chips. Samsung was getting squeezed from both ends. By late 2019, externally the cracks in Exynos' reputation were showing, and internally the pressure was mounting to justify Mongoose's existence. Samsung's fifth and ultimately final generation custom core was the Mongoose M1, appearing in the Exynos 990 chip. This chip powered the Galaxy S20 series in 2020 in some markets, a detail that foreshadowed what was to come. The M1 was developed on Samsung's new 7nm EUV process, promising better efficiency. Architecturally, it was another medium upgrade, similar in spirit to the M4's approach. The core was still immensely wide and complex. 6-wide decode, a massive execution backend featuring 13 integer pipelines. Yes, 13. And 3 FP/NEON pipelines, including specialized units for things like dot product operations. In theory, this core could chew through an extraordinary amount of instructions in parallel. Samsung claimed up to 20% performance uplift over the M4. They bumped the clock back up slightly, around 2.7 GHz boost for the M5 cores. On paper, the M5 was the most powerful CPU core Samsung ever built, a final flex of engineering muscle. But by the time the Galaxy S20 launched, the narrative had already run away from Samsung. Here's what happened. For the S20 lineup, Samsung did something unusual. In North America and a few other regions, as always, the phones used Qualcomm's latest chip, the Snapdragon 865. In Europe and other international markets, Samsung intended to use the Exynos 990 with M5 cores. However, reports emerged that even Samsung's home country of South Korea would get the Snapdragon version this time. That was unprecedented. Historically, Korea got Exynos. The message was clear. Internally, Samsung's mobile division lacked confidence in the Exynos 990's competitiveness. The Galaxy S20 became a PR headache for Exynos. Tests and user complaints painted the Exynos 990 as distinctly worse than the Snapdragon 865. Not just in one aspect, but across the board: CPU performance, GPU performance, and especially power efficiency. Benchmarks showed the M5 cores holding their own in single core against Qualcomm's designs, which by then used ARM's Cortex A77. But in overall scores, the Snapdragon jumped ahead once again. The Adreno 650 GPU in the Snapdragon was markedly ahead of the Mali G77 in the Exynos, and the battery life gap became a chasm. In some measurements, S20 Ultra with Snapdragon lasted 20 to 25% longer on a charge than the Exynos model. Phones with the Exynos 990 were observed throttling more quickly under gaming loads, causing frame rate drops and warm devices, while the Snapdragon variant stayed cooler and faster. For a user paying $1,000 plus for a flagship, that was salt in the wound. It didn't help that Samsung priced all S20 models the same globally, so a customer in London or Delhi was effectively getting less for their money than one in New York or Seoul, just because of the chip difference. The tech community's simmering frustration boiled over. Petitions were launched, demanding Samsung stop using its inferior Exynos chips in flagships. Tens of thousands signed. On forums and social media, die-hard Samsung fans vented that they felt like second-class customers. The laundry list of grievances included lower performance, shorter battery life, overheating, and even using different camera sensors in Exynos models. Another twist: some Exynos S20 units had a Samsung camera sensor versus a Sony sensor in Snapdragon units, adding to the perception of getting a subpar device. Samsung initially defended the Exynos 990 publicly, claiming that both versions passed the same rigorous tests and offered comparable experiences. But the numbers and user experiences told a different story, and everyone knew it. Perhaps the most biting criticism came from within. A report surfaced that some engineers in Samsung's chip division felt humiliated because their own company's flagship phones in Korea opted for Qualcomm chips over Exynos. Imagine working for years on Mongoose cores only to see your own company prefer the competitor's chip in your home market. Morale had to have hit rock bottom. By October 2019, even before the S20's full debacle played out, Samsung had already made a fateful decision. They quietly filed a warn notice in Texas announcing the closure of their CPU design unit. Nearly 300 jobs were cut, effective end of 2019. The Austin custom CPU team, the heart of Mongoose, was disbanded. It was officially the end of the Mongoose project. The Exynos 990 would be the last SoC featuring Samsung's in-house cores. Internally, the reasoning was straightforward. To stay competitive, Samsung had to pivot. Continuing to pour money and time into a custom CPU that wasn't clearly superior, and in practice often inferior, to off-the-shelf solutions made little sense. In a statement, Samsung said it made the decision after a thorough assessment of the business needs and to remain competitive globally. Translated from corporate speak, the custom core just wasn't worth it anymore. They would instead use standard ARM CPU cores going forward, much like other Android chip makers. With Mongoose gone, Samsung had to chart a new course for its Exynos chips. The immediate plan was clear: go back to stock or semi-stock ARM CPU cores. And that's exactly what happened in the next flagship release. The Exynos 2100, which powered the Galaxy S21 in 2021 in many regions, featured no custom Samsung cores. Instead, it packed Cortex-X1, Cortex-A78, and Cortex-A55 cores, ARM's latest and greatest at the time, in a 134 configuration. Essentially, it was spec for spec similar to Qualcomm's Snapdragon 888, which also used X1/A78 cores. The result? A much more competitive chip. The Exynos 2100 erased a good deal of the performance and efficiency gap that plagued the Exynos 990. Samsung proudly announced big jumps in power efficiency, up to 20 to 30% better than the 990, thanks to the new cores and 5nm process. At last, an Exynos and Snapdragon in the same generation were comparable. While the Exynos 2100 still slightly lagged the Snapdragon 888 in graphics and still ran a tad warmer under stress, the differences were far less dramatic. The narrative of Exynos is inferior began to soften, or at least pause, for that year. Samsung also took a bold step on the graphics front. In June 2019, they had unveiled a partnership with AMD to bring AMD's Radeon GPU technology to mobile chips. This was a signal that Samsung recognized the Mali GPU wasn't cutting it. The fruits of that partnership came in early 2022 with the Exynos 2200, featuring the new Xclipse GPU based on AMD's RDNA 2 architecture. This GPU brought features never before seen in mobile, like hardware-accelerated ray tracing. It was a big move to close the graphics gap with Qualcomm, and even possibly challenge Apple's GPU prowess. The Exynos 2200 launch, however, was a bit rocky. Yields and clock issues meant the GPU performance ended up only slightly better than previous Mali units, not a leap ahead. And Samsung's Galaxy S22 series using Exynos 2200 ran into some controversy with software throttling, the GOS scandal, where Samsung limited game performance to manage heat. It wasn't the triumphant comeback Samsung hoped for. But importantly, the CPU side of those chips continued with ARM cores, Cortex-X2, etc., and remained on par with Snapdragon in CPU capability. The era of wild performance disparities caused by the CPU was over. Samsung's reputation, though, took time to heal. In 2020 and 2021, the loud complaints had reached Samsung's upper management. By 2022, Samsung's flagship Galaxy S22 in many regions still used Exynos, except North America, China. Yet for the Galaxy S23 in 2023, Samsung took an unprecedented step. They went all in on Qualcomm Snapdragon globally, not offering Exynos in any region. This was both a temporary retreat and a strategic regrouping. It ensured the S23 series would have uniform performance, and the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 was an excellent chip, giving Galaxy users the best experience. But it also meant Samsung had zero presence of Exynos at the high end that year, a blow to pride and a potential long-term issue if they ever wanted to control their own destiny in chips. Behind the scenes, however, Samsung was not giving up on its silicon dreams. They took the lessons from Mongoose's failure to heart. Instead of trying to outdo ARM at CPU design, Samsung began focusing on building a better overall SoC and leveraging partnerships. The AMD GPU project was one such effort. Rather than do everything alone, collaborate with a graphics expert. Samsung LSI also reportedly started a clean slate project to design a Dream Team chip for Galaxy devices, targeting 2025 for a return of Exynos to prominence. This time, the approach is said to be different. No custom CPU cores, at least initially, but possibly custom optimizations around standard cores, a powerful GPU, and a renewed emphasis on power efficiency and integration. Essentially, Samsung is aiming to do what Apple does, create a chip tailored for its phones, but without the pitfall of reinventing the CPU wheel from scratch unnecessarily.